Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought today we would talk about the V-1, the good old flying bomb. And the reason for this is because there's a user mission made by Gaming Flare where you can kind of just wander about in it and have a bit of fun. The V-1 is an interesting thing because obviously in War Thunder it kind of fits but also kind of doesn't depending on how you sit on the issue. So first of all, the V-1 has actually been in the game for a long time. It's in one of the single missions in the game, which is one of the old assets from Wings of Prey. It's never really been updated and it's there so people can chase them down before they hit their targets. So the idea of does this thing fit in the game because of the whole morality around it, the idea that it was designed for terror bombing and frightening, the general populace, it doesn't really matter because it's already been here for even longer than War Thunder's existed. So the fact is it fair to bring it onto a wider audience instead of in single missions? And that is really the kind of question. Basically, the V-1 is an interesting idea. What you do is you take quite a large bomb, you attach it to what would be classed as a engine, the good old pulse jet engine, and it means that you can extend its operational range instead of just flopping it from the sky and going and hitting stuff from a very far, area or away. Some people do class it kind of as a cruise missile or one of the earliest, if not the earliest cruise missiles. I suppose kind of it is. There was a little bit of maneuvering with it, especially in the later stuff, but not a huge amount. The main warhead it had was Amatol, and Amatol being a good old explosive, it had an 850 kilo warhead in it. So this one is kind of nuts, It had an impact fuse in it. It also could have a timed fuse on it, so it could land and then blow up. And yeah, it was just kind of crazy. It was even so bad that the British had to develop tactics to try and deal with it, and also the Germans threw a ton of economical power to try and make these things even more effective than they were, even launching them from planes instead of just from the ground to try and get them going. Now, the reason why we're actually discussing it today is because of the model from Gaming Flare, but also because Penguin Red actually did a little museum kind of picture tour on Saturday, and we went through them on the stream, and one of the pictures was actually from a Swiss museum, and they had access to the Fieseler Fi-103R, the Reichenberg. So what this is basically is a manned version of the V-1 flying bomb, which is just completely nuts. This is an idea that the Germans kind of trialed, and it was very similar to the idea of the Oka from the Japanese. What you would do is you would fly it into the area, and then what you would try and do is when it was on its target, you would then parachute away before the aircraft's impact. So basically you would lose the pilot to capture, but also the pilot would be able to more accurately hit with the V-1 flying bomb because it had controls behind it. And the issue with this, or the issue with the V-1 is since it was on a specific trajectory, what a lot of planes did when they were defending Britain is they would wingtip the V-1, so therefore it would send them off course to a different target. The idea of the Fi-103R is you weren't able to do that because the pilot could then course correct, therefore they would be forced to try and take them out instead. Now, the Fi-103R was never actually used in combat. It was never employed because when they were testing it in 44, there was quite a few issues, mainly the fact that the people who were testing it were mainly volunteers, and also at the end of the day, even though the idea is to try and keep the pilot alive, it's not really going to go too well, right? Because there's always going to be issues, kind of like the Natter idea, and also a few others that the German had with the idea of the Arrowhead fighters, which would go straight through the fuselages of B-17s, and then the pilot would eject. It's just not really going to work too well at the end of the day. It also had a pretty high stall speed. There was also issues with the cramped cockpits and just a ton of different things. And when Werner Baumbach took over the KG200, which was the guys who were dealing with this, he just decided to cancel the project and just move on to the Mistel project. Now, the Mistel project is actually really interesting, and this is another thing that we could easily see in game at some point. And the idea of it is to have a standard aircraft which you would pilot and be manned, and then you would have an unmanned aircraft which was on top of it, or even manned aircraft which was on top of it and act as a parasite fighter. So you would take off and then use the top fighter to obviously do what you wanted to do. The other way that you could do it is you basically took an unmanned fighter aircraft, put it on top of like a Ju-288 or something like that, and then filled it full of explosives and used it as kind of a guided, well, I suppose missile in a way, since it did have propulsion, so then you could fling it from the air into enemies, which seems like a ridiculous idea, but we're talking about 44 Germany here, where they were trying their best to try and just make sure all of these things, or they would survive, so they were trying everything. All you have to do is look at a lot of the Blom and Voss designs and how all those went. So the question is, with these two ideas, and also with a model like this, how do you implement it into the game? Because you can't just implement it as a vehicle in the game, that you can take in lineups, because if you take it into like a realistic or, even naval or something, you're not really going to be that useful. You're only really going to be able to suicide, which is usually something people don't like. But I always thought, what if at lower tiers you had some kind of system which was similar to the nuke system at higher tiers, but instead wouldn't end the game, but would be quite impactful. And the V-1 is one of those things that you could see as a kill streak in something like Ground Arcade. So if people do really well, they could easily just, in arcade, just fly around and then be able to, hit a target by just, hitting it. Kind of like how in a lot of games like Call of Duty, where you guide in a specific, missile from the top, like a Predator missile from, a Predator drone or whatever it is. I remember that back in the day. You could do something similar in Ground Arcade, test the idea, and then if the idea works pretty well, you could literally just stick it in other parts of the game as you go. So it's pretty much as simple as that. And I think overall, it could work. You just got to get people away from the idea of the whole suicide bombing thing. But at the end of the day, a lot of people do suicide bombing anyway in War Thunder. I do think with drones and also V1s and anything like that, they do have to constantly think of ways of actually kind of putting in repair costs or putting in deterrents to actually just wasting stuff like this as well, since with drones, it's only SP, and the V1 it would probably only be SP2, but that is something for higher minds than me at the end of the day. So I think overall it's a pretty cool idea. Adding more stuff to the game is always fun, as long as it can generally be balanced out, and I'm sure it can. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.
I'd just like to thank Millie Draper, Juan the Panda, Nick R. Cupila, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie B. Young, Peter Grayling, Jerry Provolt, Bareen, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, Derek R., and Lafouche for supporting the channel.